Hi everybody and welcome. For today's video I'm going to present a game from the last round of my club championship against a fairly equal rated opponent, and the theme of this particular game is maintaining the tension in the position. In this game I was able to put my opponent under some pressure and then maintain that pressure until his position started to crumble. And I think this is a useful technique for the tournament player to have in his repertoire. So we're just going to take a look at this game. I'm going to go through the early part of the game fairly quickly. So we see d5, d4, c6, bishop to f4, knight f6, knight d2, bishop f5, and e3. So all fairly normal developing moves here. And now I played queen to b6. So one of the ideas of this sort of Karo or Slav style pawn structure that I like is that it gives the black queen access to b6 and a5. So I chose to just park that queen on the b6 square, which is just now eyeing this b2 square. As it happens, white can just ignore this threat right now because um, the resultant counterplay wouldn't be good if black were to take that pawn. But I thought this was a nice square for the queen. So my opponent though played b3 now. So um, he need not have played this, and it's sort of a little bit of a weakening move. He's creating some weaknesses on the dark squares on the queen side of his position. And now I just played e6. So e6 is paving the way for the development of the dark squared bishop on f8. And now we saw bishop to d3. After bishop to d3, the best way for black to respond would have been the following: bishop takes d3, c takes d3, and knight to d7, white would castle, and bishop to b4, kind of exploiting these weakened dark squares. And this would be approximately an equal position. However, I didn't go in for this idea and instead played what could have been a weak move had my opponent exploited it. So this knight came in at e4, and I liked the idea of preventing white from advancing this e-pawn, and it also sets up a small trap. If he takes with the knight on d2, then d takes e4 would be forking both the knight and the bishop, winning a minor piece. However, had my opponent just played bishop takes e4, then the following sequence would have been favorable for for white, because of this vulnerable e-pawn. We've got doubled pawns on the e-file, which are going to become a liability for black. Nevertheless, my opponent ignored the knight. Maybe he just wanted to keep the keep his bishop on, so he decided to castle and allowed me to have this knight loitering on the edge of his territory, which turned out to be cause him some problems later. So at this venture, a reasonable move here would have been just to develop the bishop, but instead I decided to just harass the queen here by playing knight to c3, which is quite an annoying move to deal with. The queen is forced to go to a less than optimal square. So he goes to e1. I didn't want him to push this e-pawn, so I brought the knight back now. And this is where he started to make a couple of odd moves. he played c4 here, so he's trying to gain some space on the queen side. But this allows me to just play bishop b4, and from this position I start to gain some very good tension against white's position. You can also already see that with the move queen e1, he's really restricted his rook on the f1 square, which now has no squares, no freedom of movement. And from a qualitative standpoint, this rook is inferior to the rook on the a file, which is free to move. And this is an important aspect when you're evaluating the quality of your position. How much freedom do your pieces have to move? That's really a big part of the positional aspect of chess. Anyway, he was worried about some sort of tactic here with bishop takes, and then revealing an attack on his bishop, while also still threatening this rook. So he played a passive and weak, what turned out to be a weak move here. Again, best was just bishop takes e4, but I think he wanted to preserve this bishop. And when he played bishop e2, I kind of seized the initiative here by playing queen to a5. So with queen a5, we've got this battery of the queen and bishop bearing down on the knight. And you can see now that we've got 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking this knight, and it's defended only twice by the queen and the knight, which tells us that we have to defend this piece once again or that piece will be lost. So now he plays the move rook to d1. So let's just take stock of this position. I'm just going to rotate the board here so you can see it from white's point of view. And positionally, black has a very large advantage here now, because even though only 3 of his pieces are kind of really involved in the threat on this square, it's tying up the whole white position. Obviously the rook and the queen aren't free to move because they simply don't have any squares. If the rook moves, then the knight would be lost. The knight is pinned. This knight is currently unable to move because it's defending this square. And if the bishop moves, there would be a tactic after starting with knight takes d2, where white would lose the exchange. So the only move the white is free to move at this stage is this bishop. And when I was trying to come up with a plan in this position, I realized that black really doesn't have to do anything. It's quite hard there's no easy way for white to undo this tension. So psychologically and practically, I decided that castling was the best move. So let's just rotate the board again. So by castling, I'm giving my opponent the message that, you know, I can take my time here, you're in a tough spot, what are you going to do? And maintaining the tension in a game like this can be a powerful psychological strategy that works well. So my opponent started to lash out here. Obviously I was free to take this pawn on the last move, but that wouldn't have been good because after rook to a1, white gets some counterplay, and I really want to keep the pressure on him. So he plays the move a4 now. The correct move in this position was a3, and the idea behind a3 is it prevents bishop g4, because after g4, bishop to g4, I would be attacking and undermining the defense of this knight, and would be basically winning a piece. But he's consumed with the defense of this pawn, which He really should have just left where it was and played e3 now. But instead he played a4, which is kind of a desperate move. And the strongest continuation, or one of the strongest moves, would have been bishop to g4, undermining this knight. But I didn't actually see this idea in the game, and instead played knight to d7. So again, it's a way of just saying, well, I'm just going to develop another piece. I've got 3 pieces holding down your position right now, and I'm just going to get another one into the scene of action. Well, that concludes part 1. I hope you'll join me for part 2. Thank you very much for watching.